Serbia was not officially involved in the wars. They sent paramilitary units, but they denied it, right? They didn't create any military cemeteries outside of that one in Vukovar, did not provide any standardized grave markers for the paramilitary troops. But still, I had expected to see something particular. There is something called the Serbian cross, which you see on all Serbian propaganda. It's a cross, and it has 4 C's on it, and 2 of them are backwards. And the C's symbolize Samo sloga Srbija spasava, which means only the union of Serbs can save us. And you see this everywhere in Serbian national propaganda. It's on posters, it's on propaganda, it's on their nationalist political propaganda. It's everywhere. So I assumed that this would be on their gravestones too. It's not. It's nowhere. I mean, I found it in like 2 places, but even then kind of small and insignificant. It's just not there. There was, however, a very different but very, very strong pattern to the grave markers of Serbian soldiers in the Serbian Republic, and that is this. Nearly all of them included large, life-size etchings of the deceased young man, usually in military garb, sometimes on both sides of the grave, of the marker, excuse me. And nearly all of them included also long, sentimental epitaphs relating the relationship of the deceased young man to his family, the military, and the nation. So, so you've got this guy here, and here, here. I mean, they're all, this is another one of these places where it's not a separate section, but they're nearly all together. And then these guys, it's just their headshots, but they're all together. This is one of the longer epitaphs. This guy, and you can see there's some in the back. But these are just all over the place. And on this one, well, I can talk about this later actually, so I'm going to stop with that. Okay, so a little analysis here. I need water first. The symbolism on grave markers of soldiers who died fighting for the army of Bosnia and Herzegovina fits pretty easily first into the sepulchral culture of that region. The grave markers are intended to reflect the homogeneity of traditional Islamic markers. Right? White obelisks at the head and the feet with limited inscriptions, which now include the Islamic crescent moon and star and a Quranic verse. But nonetheless, these markers also indicate the development of both a Bosnian state, but even more strongly, a Bosniak Muslim national ideology. The inclusion of the herald, the fleur-de-lis, on the grave marker of all soldiers who perished in the war recognizes the contributions of all those who died in defense of the Bosnian state. But more important, really, and stronger, was the development of the cult of the Shahid during and especially after the war. And the scholar Xavier Bugarel has really very convincingly depicted the cult of the Shahid as an important element in the Islamization of Bosnian national identity. Previously, Bosnian national identity had really been very multi-ethnic and multi-religious, and they had hoped to preserve it that way. But according to Bugarel, during the war, the Bosnian political party, which was the dominant political party, deliberately used a hierarchical vocabulary to refer to deceased soldiers as either Shahidi or fallen soldiers, with the latter being very clearly second class, and in some cases even derogatory. Now, whether or not this hierarchical approach was understood by all Bosnian citizens who, as I say, before the war were pre-multi-ethnic and overwhelmingly secular, is a little unclear, but I'm certainly inclined to see this trend as evidence toward the further Islamicization of the entire population. And an effort by the regime to deny, whenever possible, the existence of non-Muslim citizens. Bugarel himself describes the hostility of some non-religious Muslims to having their deceased sons referred to as Shahidi. They didn't want them described always in those terms. And even more so, the tensions that developed in Tuzla, where the media described the term Shahid as creating an atmosphere of discrimination against non-Muslim soldiers in the army. So while one might argue that the shape and specific symbols on Bosnian grave markers are consistent with the extant local culture, the new military cemeteries have to be seen as part of the construction of Bosnia's new national and explicitly Muslim identity. The overwhelming prevalence of state symbolism on Croat grave markers is really not so surprising, given that Croat national ideology from the 19th century onward always focused on the concept of what was called state rights. Ivo Banac has argued since whatever the 1980s, right, that for reasons associated with legitimist forms of argument forced on them by Vienna and Budapest from the 18th and 19th century on, the Croats were never comfortable with merely cultural forms of nationalism, but always insisted on connecting them to historical and state rights. And apparently that tradition has been deeply ingrained in the Croat population, which promotes them and now puts them on their grave markers, right? Along with, to be fair, more cultural symbols and religious symbols as well, like the braided cross, the Virgin Mary, and Jesus and Cupids, and so on. It is, to me, I have to say, still peculiar that the state of Croatia has yet to formalize its independence in a way that would memorialize its war dead, and perhaps this is a lacuna yet to be rectified in the coming years. And finally, while it's tempting to interpret the grave markers of ordinary Serbian soldiers according to Serbia's national ideology, they just don't really fit, right? So, on the other hand, it may be possible to understand them in terms of Serbia's traditional sepulchral culture and to see the etchings and the epitaphs, as a modern representation of Serbia's traditional laments. To be sure, this connection is a little bit tenuous, and there are some important differences between the two. Most obviously, funeral laments, which were really typical of rural Serbia and actually the whole southern Balkans, were oral and transitory, remaining only in the memory of those who attended the funeral. And these epitaphs, of course, have been inscribed in stone for all time. And yet both the lament and the epitaph were intended to make the deeds of the deceased and the grief of those left behind part of a communal memory. Second, the laments were created and performed almost exclusively by women, whereas these inscribed epitaphs are either gender neutral or present the voices of different family members. And that's what I wanted to mention here. It's not entirely obvious, but you have these two wings, and there are epitaphs on each side of the wings, actually front and back, and each one is from a different family member. So this one starts out, Dragi bratis, dear brother, right? And the other one says, dear son, right? And on the front it was, was from the mother. One's from the mother, one's from the father, one's from the sister, or whatever. They're all from different family members, right? So they're still very personal. But even so, most of them are about love and family, with occasional connections to duty to the homeland. And then finally, it's evident, of course, that if you do much historiographical reading on this, that the traditional laments were far more elaborate and poetic than most of the epitaphs that you see on these recent soldiers' graves. And yet what these modern grave markers may lack in elegance, they really make up for with emotion. And by combining the epitaphs and the full-length photos together, they really create this sense of emotional intimacy that is missing from the other grave markers. And it's that emotional intimacy, I would argue, that most clearly connects them to Serbia's sepulchral culture, and then most clearly differentiates them from either the more formal Croats, Catholic Croats, and the deliberately homogenized Muslim sepulchral culture of their ethnic neighbors. So, if I go back to the title of the paper, which is what did they die for, and try to answer it based on the grave markers of the different ethnic groups. In Bosnia, an answer to that question might be they died for Allah. In Croatia, it might be they died for Croatia. In Serbia, it's a little harder. There would probably be something about dying for the homeland, but an equally strong message is something that's more personal and would say something like, we are grieving terribly and you will always be alive in our hearts and memories. That's it. Thank you.
And questions for Dr. Lilly?
Excuse me, in your title, this is 1945 to 1995.
Yeah.
Talked about as like 1991 to 95, roughly. Is that
That's the time period of the war. But my larger project, which is the part that deals with the legal changes from the takeover of communism to the communist takeover of Yugoslavia up to, and what I'm actually a little bit on weaker ground with is I might have to go beyond 1995 because there are such interesting grave markers that continue. But yeah, this particular paper, to be fair, probably should be mostly 91 to 95, true. But the whole project goes from 45 to 95. Yeah. Yes?
What got you interested in this particular thing?
Yeah.
It's such a narrow...
It is. Oh. Well, let me find that for you. If I can. I was in Yugoslavia, and first of all, cemeteries are just really interesting, and you can't, and the ones in Europe are a lot more interesting than the ones that we have here. But it was this. This was the guy that got me interested in this. I was in a cemetery in Yugoslavia for some completely different reason, and ran across this picture on somebody's gravestone and thought, you've got to be kidding. You've got to be kidding. What mother would want this on her son's gravestone? He's a mafia guy, presumably, and I was so stunned. But the other reason then was, and the pictures that you see are increasingly bizarre, the other reason was that I was there at the same time when I saw this picture, people were telling me constantly about the desecrations of graves by Muslims against Serbs. And the way they talked about it, it was like this was the worst thing that anybody could ever do to anybody else. It was worse than rape, it was worse than murder, it was worse than anything that anybody could do to anyone else. And it just made me think that there was something interesting about this. That this was another sort of weapon in ethnic conflict. The use of cemeteries and gravestones was another weapon that I hadn't really ever thought about in that way. So then the trick has always been to figure out how to connect something like this with something